Dolomites, Italian front, December 1916. 10,000 soldiers buried alive in a single day. White Friday, they called it. But the avalanches weren't the worst part. It was what the survivors heard, calling their names from 30 feet of packed snow. From the depths of my collection, the War Maestro brings you the final journal entries of men who discovered that some voices should never be answered, because in the high Alps, the dead don't stay quiet. The Italian Alpine front of World War I was perhaps the most brutal theater of the entire conflict, where soldiers fought not just each other but the mountains themselves. At altitudes above 10,000 feet, more men died from cold and avalanches than from enemy bullets. The Italian Second Army's winter offensive had stalled in the Dolomites by November 1916, leaving thousands of men carved into the living rock at altitudes where human lungs barely function. Corporal Luca Ferraro pressed his face against the observation slit of Bunker 7, watching snow devils dance across the ridge they called Valle dei Sussurri. The locals had named it the Valley of Whispers, long before the war came to these peaks, though none would explain why. Ferraro commanded 16 men of the Battaglione Alpini Monte Marmolada, seasoned mountaineers who understood that in the high Alps, the cold killed faster than any Austrian bullet. At 24, he was the eldest among them, a veteran of 2 Isonzo offensives who had volunteered for this posting because someone had to keep these boys alive through the winter. The bunker system tunneled deep into the Marmolada Glacier itself, rooms carved from ice that never melted, walls that wept constantly in the dim lamplight. Their orders were simple: maintain observation of Austrian positions across the valley and report any movement. What the orders failed to mention was how the ice carried sound in ways that defied explanation, how voices seemed to travel through solid rock, how the men had begun waking with frost on their eyelashes, despite sleeping in the deepest chambers. Private Donato emerged from the communications tunnel, his face pale beneath his wool cap. He had been trying to raise headquarters for 3 days without success. The telephone lines, buried beneath 6 feet of snow, carried only static now. Sometimes, Donato claimed, the static resolved into words, fragments of conversation in dialects he did not recognize. Ferraro studied the kid's haunted expression and made a mental note to rotate him off communications duty. Isolation played tricks on a man's mind, especially at this altitude where every breath was work and sleep came fitfully. He had seen strong men break from less, had carried their frozen bodies down mountains when their minds simply gave up the fight against the cold. What concerned him more were the reports from the sentries about voices in the night, always just beyond the range of understanding, always seeming to call from the depths of the glacier itself. The whispers began on December 8th, 5 days before the avalanches that would bury half the Italian Alpine Corps. Ferraro recorded the first incident in his patrol log with the dry precision of a man who trusted only what he could see and touch. Private Benedetti had been standing guard at the forward observation post, a cramped ice cave that jutted from the glacier face like a frozen tumor. At 200 hours, he heard his name called from somewhere deep within the mountain, not shouted, whispered, in his mother's voice. Ferraro questioned Benedetti thoroughly. The boy swore the voice came from behind him, from the solid ice wall that formed the back of the observation post. When he turned to investigate, pressing his ear against the frozen surface, he heard her again, closer this time. She was asking why he had not written home in 3 weeks. The rational explanation was simple enough. Benedetti's mother had died of influenza 2 months prior. The boy carried her final letter in his breast pocket, read it nightly by candlelight until the paper grew soft as cloth. Grief and altitude sickness were a dangerous combination. Ferraro assigned him to interior duties and made a note to watch for signs of complete breakdown. But then, Private Toriani reported hearing German voices from within the ice walls of the sleeping chamber. Not conversations or commands, but whispers in a dialect he recognized from his childhood in South Tyrol. The voices spoke of home, of warm bread, and summer festivals that had not existed since 1914. When Toriani pressed his face against the ice to listen more closely, his cheeks stuck to the surface. It took 2 men to pull him free, leaving skin behind. Sergeant Caruso discovered the first physical evidence 3 days later while inspecting the ammunition storage tunnel. Carved into the ice wall, barely visible in the lamplight, were words scratched with fingernails. Italian words, but in script so old that Caruso could barely make them out. They appeared to be names, dozens of them. Some he recognized as men who had died in the earlier fighting around Monte Grappa. Ferraro studied the scratches for an hour, running his fingers over letters that cut deep into ice that should have been hard as granite. The temperature in the tunnel never rose above -20 degrees Fahrenheit. No human fingernail could carve such marks, yet there they were, fresh enough that ice crystals still clung to the grooves. The storm hit on December 10th, sealing them inside the glacier for what would prove to be their final days above ground. Wind speeds reached 90 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally across the peaks with such force that visibility dropped to 0 beyond the bunker entrance. Ferraro ordered all exterior positions abandoned, as the mountain itself seemed to shake under the assault. It was during the storm's second night that Private Rossi vanished from the latrine tunnel. He had gone to relieve himself at 2,130 hours, and simply never returned. Ferraro organized search parties, but the latrine connected to a natural cave system that honeycombed the glacier's interior. They found no trace of the man, no blood, no torn clothing. Most disturbing of all, they found no footprints in the snow that had drifted into the tunnel entrance. It was as if Rossi had simply ceased to exist. The search did yield one discovery that chilled Ferraro more than the missing soldier. Wedged behind a pillar of ice in the deepest tunnel, Private Milano found a leather satchel bearing Austro-Hungarian military markings. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a field journal written in German. The final entry was dated December 15th, 1915, exactly 1 year ago. Ferraro's German was functional enough to translate the crucial passages. The journal belonged to Corporal Klaus Steiner of the Austrian Mountain Regiment. Steiner's unit had been stationed in these same tunnels during the previous winter, before the Italians captured the position in the spring offensive. His entries grew increasingly erratic as winter deepened, describing voices in the ice that called to his men in the voices of dead comrades. Steiner wrote of soldiers who would wander into the glacier's depths, following voices that promised warmth and rest. They were always found days later, frozen solid, their faces peaceful but their eyes wide open as if listening to something wonderful. The Austrian medic attributed these deaths to hypothermia and altitude psychosis, but Steiner suspected something else, something he called the voce bianca, the white voice. The final entry made Ferraro's hands shake as he read it aloud to his remaining men. Steiner described hearing his dead father calling from deep within the mountain, speaking words of comfort in the dialect of his childhood village. The voice promised an end to the cold, an end to the war, an end to all suffering. All Steiner had to do was follow it into the heart of the glacier. Below this entry, in handwriting that grew increasingly unsteady, Steiner had written a warning in broken Italian, as if he knew who would eventually find his journal. The words were simple but urgent. If you hear them whisper, do not answer. They only call to the ones ready to go. That night, 3 more men reported hearing familiar voices from within the ice walls. Ferraro posted double guards and ordered no one to venture into the deeper tunnels alone. But as he lay in his sleeping roll, he could swear he heard something calling his name from somewhere far below, in a voice that sounded remarkably like his mother. By December 12th, Ferraro's command had dissolved into something resembling a ghost story more than a military unit. Of his original 16 men, only 11 remained. Besides Rossi, 4 others had simply walked into the deeper tunnels and never returned. The searches had been abandoned after Sergeant Caruso emerged from the ice caves speaking in tongues, his fingers bloodied from clawing at the frozen walls. Private Donato had stopped maintaining the radio entirely. He spent his hours hunched over the communications equipment, listening to static that he claimed carried conversations between dead soldiers. Sometimes he would respond, speaking into the microphone with tears streaming down his face, addressing men by names Ferraro recognized from casualty reports filed months ago. The remaining soldiers had divided into two groups. Half believed they were experiencing mass hallucinations brought on by carbon monoxide poisoning from their heating braziers and the thin air at altitude. The other half had begun carving names into every available surface, working with a frantic intensity that left their fingertips raw and bleeding. They carved the names of brothers, fathers, childhood friends, anyone who had died since this war began. Ferraro found Private Galli in the ammunition storage room at dawn, scratching his dead brother's name into the ice wall over and over again. The boy's fingers were blue with frostbite, but he continued carving even as Ferraro tried to pull him away. When questioned, Galli explained that his brother Marco had been calling to him all night, describing their mother's cooking and the sound of church bells in their village. Marco had died at the Isonzo River in August, but his voice through the ice was clearer than any memory. The rational part of Ferraro's mind cataloged every possible explanation. Altitude sickness, carbon monoxide exposure, prolonged isolation, survivor's guilt manifesting as auditory hallucinations. He had seen men break under lesser pressures, yet when he pressed his own ear to the ice walls during his midnight inspections, he heard them too. Voices speaking in dialects from across Italy, from Austria, from regions he had never visited. They spoke of home with a longing that cut deeper than any bayonet. The voices knew things they should not know. They described the taste of bread from specific bakeries, the way particular church bells sounded on Sunday mornings, the exact words of lullabies sung by mothers who had been dead for years. When Private Torriani heard his grandmother singing the song she had hummed while mending clothes, he wept like a child and begged Ferraro to let him follow the voice deeper into the glacier. Ferraro's own breaking point came that night when he heard his mother calling from the communications tunnel. Her voice was exactly as he remembered from childhood, warm and patient, asking why he had not come home for dinner. She promised his favorite meal was waiting, that his father had forgiven him for enlisting against their wishes. All he had to do was follow her voice through the ice. December 13th dawned with an ominous stillness that every Alpine veteran recognized as the prelude to disaster. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky so blue it hurt to look at, and snow piled in unstable formations across every slope. Ferraro had seen avalanche conditions before, but never quite like this. The mountain felt poised, waiting. Only 7 men remained under his command. The others had vanished during the night, drawn away by voices that promised reunion with the dead. Ferraro had tried to stop Private Benedetti, grabbing the boy's arm as he sleepwalked toward the deepest tunnel, but Benedetti had looked through him with eyes that saw only his dead mother waiting in the ice. The boy's strength was inhuman as he pulled free and disappeared into the glacier's heart. The survivors huddled in the main chamber, no longer pretending this was about military duty or holding positions against the Austrians. They were simply trying to last until rescue came, though their radio had been silent for days and no patrol could reach them through the fresh snowfall. Private Milano had not spoken in 12 hours, sitting motionless while frost formed on his eyelashes. When Ferraro checked for signs of life, Milano whispered that his infant son was crying somewhere in the ice, and he was trying very hard not to listen. At 630 hours, the mountain began to move. Not the sharp crack of rifle fire or the rumble of artillery, but something deeper and more fundamental. The glacier itself was shifting, responding to pressures that had been building for days. Through the observation slit, Ferraro watched entire cliff faces peel away from the mountainside and cascade into the valleys below. This was not a single avalanche, but a systematic collapse of the entire Alpine system. The ice walls of their bunker began to weep more heavily, streams of meltwater running down surfaces that had been frozen solid for months. The temperature inside the tunnels was rising, not from any external heat source, but from the mountain's own movement, generating friction deep within its core. Ferraro realized with growing horror that their glacier refuge was becoming unstable. As the rumbling grew louder, the voices in the ice became clearer. Not whispers now, but full conversations in languages living and dead. Ferraro heard Latin mixed with modern Italian, German dialects that predated the empire, and sounds that might have been human speech, but felt older than words. The voices were no longer calling to individual soldiers, but singing in unison, a chorus that seemed to welcome the mountain's collapse. Private Donato began laughing, a sound more terrifying than any scream. He pointed at the radio equipment where the dials were spinning wildly, picking up signals that could not exist. Through the static came the clear sound of military communications from units that had been destroyed months ago, reporting positions that no longer existed to commanders who had died at the Isonzo. When the Avalanche finally hit their position at 847 hours, Ferraro's last coherent thought was that the voices had gone silent. After days of constant whispering, the ice had finally stopped talking. Lieutenant Alessandro Bianchi led the recovery patrol up the Marmolada face on March 15, 1917, 3 months after White Friday had buried entire battalions beneath tons of snow and ice. The spring thaw had begun revealing the war's frozen casualties across the Dolomites, and Bianchi's men had already recovered 47 bodies from positions that had been considered permanently lost. The site of Bunker 7 proved particularly challenging to excavate. The avalanche had compressed the snow into ice as hard as concrete, requiring steam hoses and picks to penetrate more than a few feet. When they finally broke through into the tunnel system, the first thing that struck Bianchi was the complete absence of decay. The cold had preserved everything exactly as it had been on December 13th. They found 8 soldiers in the main chamber, arranged in a circle facing inward, as if they had been having a conversation when the avalanche struck. All were frozen upright, their eyes wide open, and mouths slightly parted. Their expressions were not those of men who had died in terror or pain, but rather of individuals listening intently to something just beyond hearing. Most disturbing was the complete absence of survival attempts. No clawed walls, no desperate messages, no signs that any of them had tried to dig their way out. Private Agnelli, the youngest member of Bianchi's recovery team, found Corporal Ferraro's journal wedged behind a support beam in the communications tunnel. The leather cover was pristine despite months under the ice, and the final entries were written in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as the days progressed. Bianchi read the entries aloud to his men, noting how Ferraro's rational military reports gradually gave way to descriptions of voices and disappearing soldiers. The final entry, dated December 13th at 630 hours, consisted of only a few lines written in a hand, so shaky it was barely legible. Ferraro had written that the voices were no longer whispers but songs, melodies he remembered from childhood, that his mother had hummed while working in their kitchen. He described hearing his entire family calling to him from deep within the glacier, their voices harmonizing in a way that made the ice itself seem to sing. Below this, in letters so faint they were almost invisible, Ferraro had scratched one final warning. If you hear them whisper, do not answer. They only call to the ones ready to go. Bianchi ordered the bodies removed for proper burial, but his men reported difficulty lifting the frozen corpses. They seemed heavier than they should have been, as if the ice had somehow bonded with their flesh and clothing. When they finally managed to extract the remains, several soldiers swore they could hear faint sounds coming from deeper within the glacier. Voices, speaking in dialects they could not identify, calling names they did not recognize. The official record lists the Marmolada incident as a standard avalanche casualty, 8 soldiers killed by natural disaster during the harsh winter of 1916. Lieutenant Bianchi filed his report with the 2nd Army headquarters, noting the excellent preservation of the remains and the recovery of important military documents. He made no mention of the voices his men claimed to hear, or the way their radio equipment malfunctioned whenever they approached the excavation site. What Bianchi did not include in his official documentation was the discovery made by Private Agnelli during the final day of recovery operations. While searching the deepest accessible tunnel for additional remains, Agnelli found names carved into the ice walls that extended far beyond what Ferraro's men could have reached. Dozens of names in multiple languages, some in scripts so old that the unit's historian could not identify their origin. Most disturbing were the dates carved beside the names, spanning decades and even centuries before the Great War had brought soldiers to these peaks. Modern mountaineers who climb the Marmolada report strange acoustic phenomena in the valleys below the old battle sites. Radio equipment picks up fragments of conversation in Italian and German, always faint, always just beyond clear comprehension. Guide services now avoid camping in certain areas where climbers report restless sleep and dreams of voices calling from beneath the snow. In 1982, a team of archaeologists investigating Great War artifacts in the region made an unsettling discovery. While using ground-penetrating radar to map buried fortifications, their equipment detected hollow spaces deep within the glacier that did not correspond to any known tunnel systems. These voids appeared to form a network extending throughout the mountain's core, chambers that had never been carved by human hands but seemed to channel sound with perfect acoustic properties. The archaeologists abandoned their project after recording equipment placed near these deep chambers picked up sounds that their official report described only as anomalous acoustic events. Unofficial accounts from team members describe hearing conversations in languages that predated Roman occupation of the Alps, voices discussing battles that had never been recorded in any historical document. Local climbing guides, when pressed after several drinks, will sometimes admit that the mountain still talks. They describe nights when the wind carries conversations between soldiers who died decades ago, discussions of home and family that continue despite the speakers having long since turned to ice and bone. Some guides refuse to lead expeditions into certain valleys, claiming that clients who spend too much time listening to the mountain's whispers have been known to wander away from their camps, following voices that promise rest and warmth in the heart of the glacier. The Valle dei Sussurri remains largely unmarked on modern topographical maps, though satellite imagery clearly shows the valley's distinctive shape. Those who know where to look can still find remnants of the tunnel systems, ice-filled passages that extend far deeper into the mountain than any military engineer ever designed. And sometimes, on nights when the wind is still and the temperature drops below -30 degrees Fahrenheit, visitors report hearing their names called softly from within the ice, spoken in voices they recognize, but know they will never answer. If the voices from the Marmolada Glacier still echo in your mind, then you're ready to join the War Maestro's archive. Check the walls around you. Do you hear any whispers? Subscribe to uncover more buried military horrors that history tried to forget. Hit that notification bell, because when the next classified file thaws from the ice, you'll want to be the first to know. Share this tale with fellow seekers of authentic military horror. Those who understand that the most terrifying stories are the ones that really happened. Remember, in the high mountains, some voices never stop calling, and some soldiers are still listening.